All right. My name is Sam Selikoff, and I'm excited to be talking to you about, well, Next and React today. And some of the things that Guillermo talked about in the keynote are actually a nice little tee-up for my talk, because what I'm going to be talking about is how a lot of these improvements and innovations we've gotten in Next in the last year are really delivering on React's vision for the future. So when I first heard about React server components, I was really excited because I was excited that we were finally getting a first-class way to do data fetching in React. This is a great video, and Sebastian and Andrew kind of trace the history and the evolution of server components and suspense, and how server components are basically data fetching for suspense. And we were all kind of waiting for a first-class way to do data fetching in React apps so that we could all stop kind of using our own solutions. We could have things that work together. And server components is basically what we got. But when I first heard about this, I was a little skeptical, because there's a lot I like about fetching data in the client. My use SWR hook, does this mean I can't use this anymore? You know, when you get an SPA set up with a hook like use SWR or use query on the client, there's a lot of really nice things that fall out from this. You get to drop this in your component. It can render a loading state and fetch data. It can revalidate. It can populate a client-side cache so that subsequent navigations are really fast. And so I was a little bit skeptical, but I knew that APIs come to React with a lot of thought, and so I kind of withheld judgment until I saw something that really stuck with me, and that was this. This is a server component. It fetches data right inside of the component boundary. It has a direct handle to the database to fetch data, but then it renders a component inside of a modal. And this modal does all sorts of cool stuff on the client. It comes up from the bottom, and it renders our news story inside of it, and it attaches click listeners to keyboard events like escape that we can press to close it. So I didn't know what it was at the time, but this somehow struck me as more React than any code I had written before that accomplished everything that this component did. And so it's kind of what started getting me excited for this new paradigm in React. So why does this feel more like React than stuff that we've had in the past? Well, let's talk about React. What do we like about React? Well, a lot of people say it feels like playing with Legos. It's fun and it's easy to use, and it feels like Legos. Well, let's talk about Legos. Why do people like Legos? Legos come in all different sorts of shapes and sizes and colors, but they can all be broken down to a single interface, right? It's a brick that has tubes and studs, and you can snap them into each other. And that's it. That is all you need to know to build basically anything you want. You can start snapping Legos together, and you can get smaller pieces into bigger pieces. You can snap those big pieces into each other, and you can keep going until you have what you want. And I think this story is really what people like most about React, what we love about building with React, because it feels very similar. We can start with a news story, and we can decide to put it in a modal that has all sorts of cool behavior. We can add a few more news stories, and we can wrap those in a carousel. And so what we're really talking about here is a story of composition. Composability is really what makes building UIs like this so easy and fun. But this only applies to kind of the UI side of the app equation, right? These modals and carousels are really nice and tidy and composable, but this news story, it needs data, right? So how do we get data into this news story? Well, if I was using SWR, I might do something like this. Drop my use SWR hook in and hit an endpoint to fetch some data. And if we're waiting on the query, we'll return a loading state. Otherwise, we'll render the data. So this is pretty cool. I can drop this into my component, render a news story, and if we refresh the page here, we'll throw the new story in a page, refresh the page, we see the loading spinner, and then we see the data. So this is nice, but we want to server render this page. And so if we're only fetching on the client, we can't do that. Maybe we want to use some of this data in an OG tag for a server rendered page, or maybe we just want to server render it for all the benefits that Guillermo was talking about. So if we want to server render this component, then we can't use something like SWR. But we're Next developers, right? So we have getServerSideProps. So let's use getServerSideProps to build out this. And this is going to be a function that runs on the server, lets us query our data and return it. And this is all going to happen before we start rendering on the client so that we can get the data to our news story. And to do this, we only need to make a few changes. We are going to pass that data through the page. And that means we need to give it to our news story. So instead of just rendering a news story, we're going to give it the data for the article, which means we need to make an update so that news story gets its data. And now we have a server-rendered news story component. And if we refresh, we're going to see the browser loading spinner, and then we're going to see the page render. So this is nice. We're rendering on the server, has all sorts of benefits. We see the data right away. The first time news story is rendered, it has its data that it needs in order to display the article. But we've lost something here, right? By making the component accept its data as a prop, it's no longer composable. Because news story now has a dependency on getServerSideProps, right? Because getServerSideProps returns the data, and that is needed for news story to work. So if we look back at our earlier example where we had a modal carousel news story, this is not really what we have anymore, right? We now have a modal carousel news story and getServerSideProps. We've broken the composability of this story, and news story is not composable anymore the way the modal is. If we want to copy a modal or a carousel around our app, all we need to do is copy and paste it. But now every time we copy news story, we have to remember to copy getServerSideProps. It's something we have to be conscious of. So it's kind of broken this React programming model that we all love. And this is true anytime we add any dependency on a server-side API to our components, right? And the reality is that all of our apps need to interact with server-side APIs and services, whether it's our database or services like Stripe or AWS. Every time we add that to one of our components, then the component is not a Lego block anymore. And this is the essential conflict here. On the one hand, we want the composability of React because it's what makes it fun and easy to use. But on the other hand, we want our apps to talk to external services. They have to, like databases and third-party services. So we want to be able to copy around components, but we can't as soon as they have a dependency on a server-side API. Or can we? What if this is how we rendered our news story, but this was a server-rendered news story? This is how we could render on the server a news story directly from our database. Well, if that was the case and we wanted to copy news story over to our About page, how do we do that? We just copy and paste it, just like any other component. And what if we wanted to put it inside of a modal and add a few more news stories and wrap it in a carousel? And this is all still happening on the server. Our news story is still rendering on the server. If we could do that, news story has become a Lego block again, and it has all those benefits that we love about React. So let's take a look at news story. News story is a React server component. It's an async function, and it has a direct handle to a database within the component boundary. Everything it needs is contained. So it's just like our original SWR example because we can just copy and paste it around, but it can be rendered on the server. And we don't need to copy around getServerSideProps to different parts that need it. So it doesn't need its external data passed in. It has all the benefits of both previous solutions, but it's back to being a Lego block. All right, let's add another Lego block. Recommended reads. We'll throw this right below our news story. And this is pretty cool. We now have all these recommended reads, and they're all still being rendered on the server. So when the page is first ready, all the data is there. We don't see a loading state. We just see all the data. But we're still playing with Legos. We just drop that into our React tree. Now, there's an interesting thing about this page. If we refresh it, it takes a little bit longer to render because both news story and recommended reads are fetching data and rendering. However, the article here, Travis and Taylor, he plays my favorite position in the NFL. He's got a $50 million contract, and well, now he's dating Taylor Swift, so I'm not jealous or anything. Good for him, good for him. Okay, so the interesting thing about this page is that it takes up the whole browser width, and only when we scroll do we actually see those recommended reads. So wouldn't it be cool if we could defer rendering the recommended reads so that the page could have an initial render that's faster? Well, let's add suspense. So we'll wrap recommended reads in a suspense boundary. And now if we refresh, we're going to see a faster initial render. And then when we scroll, we'll see the suspense fall back, and then the recommended reads pop in. And all of this is still happening on the server, which is super cool, and is thanks to Next supporting all of React's server-side streaming APIs. And suspense. Suspense feels a lot like a Lego brick, doesn't it? We're still just throwing it into our tree, composing it with all of our other React components. And finally, maybe we can make these recommended reads a little bit bigger and throw them in a carousel, and we can add some animation there. So let's take a look at what we ended up with here. It looks like a very simple React tree, but there's a lot happening. News story and recommended reads are depending on server-side APIs within the component. They are using server-side APIs on the server. And the modal and carousel are using browser APIs. They're using APIs to animate. They're getting references to elements. They are attaching click handlers to listen for clicking outside of the modal, or keyboard listeners to listen for hitting escape to close. So we have server-only and client-only pieces that are running in two different places. They're running in a browser, they're running in a server, but in our template, it feels like a single app. The fact that these are running in different worlds hasn't hurt the composability story of this. We're able to write client code right next to server code in a way that still feels like playing with Legos. And this is pretty amazing because usually when we start writing server code to interact with our React app is when it stops feeling like playing with Legos. And we have to use framework-specific APIs to cross that gap. So React has given us the building blocks here to wrap both concerns within the same interface, the React component boundary. And how the heck does this all work? Well, if you look at this, there is a lot happening between these lines in our editor. And Next is taking our server components, running them on the server. It's also route and code splitting all of the client code and the client components and shipping that up to the browser. Next.js is doing all of that for us, effectively running two different apps. But again, from our perspective, it feels like one. So that's pretty cool. And let's talk about one more thing. We'll add one more feature to this little demo app that we have. And that is a bookmark feature. So we have our news story here, and we want to add a bookmark. So let's make a bookmark component in our news story so the user can save it. And let's take a look at bookmark. So bookmark renders a button with a little icon, and when we click on the button, it sends a fetch request to an API endpoint. And the API endpoint is in our Next app. It's just a simple API handler here that inserts a bookmark using the slug from the request. So now that our news story has a bookmark inside of it, is it still a Lego block? Well, it's kind of like a news story plus an API server running somewhere for it to actually work, right? So again, the server-side concerns, the dependency here, has leaked outside of the component boundary. And this is where server actions come in. So if we come here and look at our bookmark, all we need to do is change onClick to form action. And then right here in the action, we can use the server directive, which tells React and tells Next to run this code on the server. And that means instead of calling an API endpoint, we can replace this with the code that was in our API endpoint. It has, again, a direct handle to the database, and it goes ahead and runs that code to insert the new bookmark. And so server actions have let us put our API endpoint back into the component boundary in the same way that server components let us move getServerSideProps into the component boundary. And so now, news story, in spite of having a server-side mutation, is back to being a Lego block. And so now our tree is back to being a simple tree. It's all encapsulated, and we can copy it around without having to be conscious of any other part that's needed for it to work. So pretty cool. This is basically, I think, the most compelling part of server actions and server components, this new React paradigm, which Next has done a really good job packaging up into Next 13 in the app router over the last year and letting us all try out this new paradigm and figure out what it means for our apps. And basically, we now have the tools to bring any server-side concern inside of the component so that playing with components that have server-side components feels like playing with Legos again. And if you think about it, really like the first 10 years of React could be thought of as having done this for browser APIs, right? In the earlier days of React, there were some times where you would have a component like a modal that had to render outside the tree so that it could be rendered on top and not inside the current children where the component is rendered. And so you would have to maybe have some code that added something to the body. Or maybe a component would render and you'd want it to subscribe to a WebSocket service, and so you'd have to write that code somewhere. It wasn't neatly tied up into the component boundary. And over time, we got APIs like portals and useEffect. And now, portals let you just render a modal that's going to be appended outside the tree so that it behaves like a well-behaved modal. And you don't have to think about that. Or you can use effect to subscribe and unsubscribe to WebSocket channels. And so these days, we have this rich ecosystem of React components for all sorts of UI concerns. And we can just drop in a modal or a dialog or a dropdown. And we don't have to think about it because all the implementation details are encapsulated inside of that modal component API, that interface. And now we're basically seeing this happen for our server-side concerns. And so what does this mean kind of going forward? Like, where do we go from here now that we can fetch data and write data with server actions inside our component? What's next? And so far, we've really been talking about a local database that we're using for our app, but news story and recommended reads, they can't really be reused outside of my app. They're just for my domain. But things like modal dialogues from libraries like Radix and React Aria or dropdowns, those aren't domain specific. Those I just grab from NPM these days and drop it in my app. And again, that's some of the most fun and easy parts of what I do. So what other parts of our apps talk to server-side APIs? Well, when you add Stripe to your app, usually you have to set up an API endpoint. Maybe it has some privileged secrets or API keys. You usually also have to have an API endpoint that responds to webhook events. Imagine if adding Stripe to your React app was as simple as this. It could be. What about an S3 uploader, something that interacts with AWS? Again, usually you have a UI part of something that lets you upload objects to S3, but you also have an API route because you need to get a signature from AWS to make sure you have permission to upload to your bucket. What if all of that was packaged inside the component boundary? Or what if you had an auth service and this is how you rendered a sign-in form? And again, that was it. You don't have to add anything else. If you wanted to copy this to another part of your app, you just copy this React tree. You can throw it in a modal. That would be awesome. What if we had a a CMS that was thought from the ground up for server actions and server components, and decomposed in the way these headless UI libraries do these days, so we still have complete control over the styling. But to render data from our CMS, you just render it, you point to the field, and it takes care of pulling it down. And then forms that let you update it and have actions bundled inside of them that you never even need. You just submit the form, it hits your CMS. You could view draft versions of your CMS content, all just by rendering components and changing the props, just the way we do with UI stuff today. So I don't know about you, but if this is what it's going to look like to add server-side APIs to our app, to write server code in our React apps, and it's going to be this easy and fun, just like it is with the UI stuff today, then that makes me really excited about the future of React. So thank you.